Good afternoon, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute and our event this afternoon, Combating Homelessness in America's Cities. My name is Howard Husock. I'm a senior fellow here at AEI. I focus on cities, city housing policy, and civil society, and all those topics come together for our discussion this afternoon. Encampments of those we refer to as the street homeless have become a troubling feature of cities across the United States. Tents crowded together under bridges and in downtown parts can be found from San Francisco to New York, from Los Angeles to Chicago, on the waterfronts and riverside of Seattle and Portland, and here in our nation's capital in Washington, D.C. Official numbers, and they may understate the issue, from the Department of Housing and Urban Development show that since 2010, homelessness has generally been declining nationwide, but it's growing in many jurisdictions, particularly in California. The very term homelessness suggests, however, that the best approach to assisting those in need and those sleeping on the streets would require more low-rent housing. This approach has underpinned much of the progressive urban governance approaches to street homelessness. It's perhaps best embodied by President Biden's recently announced House America initiative, which will focus on partnering with cities to provide permanent housing and build affordable units for those experiencing homelessness. But is housing the underlying problem, or even the most important problem that explains the rise of street homelessness? Federal surveys have found that at least 25% of so-called rough sleepers suffer from serious mental illness, 45% of mental illness of some kind, and of the 140,000 people who are seriously mentally ill on the streets, this is not garden variety anxiety or melancholy. This can be schizophrenia. This can be bipolar disorder. Others are haunted by the demon of addiction. As the Substance Abuse and Treatment Center has reported, tragically, homelessness and substance abuse go hand in hand. The end result of homelessness is often substance abuse, and substance abuse often contributes to homelessness. And the National Coalition for the Homeless has found that 38% of homeless people are alcohol dependent, another 26% on harmful chemicals. Should our policy approach involve new means to provide psychiatric and substance abuse treatment to those living on the streets? Or must we provide housing first as a prerequisite to making treatment available? What underpins the history of the so-called housing first movement and its proliferation in cities and its approach to combating homelessness? Before we go any further and introduce our panelists today, and we have an outstanding panel, we want to make our audience aware of a Q&A section in the last 15 minutes of our hour-long program. If you have a question you'd like to submit, please submit it to the email listed below on the screen or to the hashtag AEI on cities. As I said, we're joined today by a distinguished panel, all of whom are deeply familiar with the homelessness problem and the policy debates surrounding it. Lisa Dailey is the executive director of the Treatment Advocacy Center, which since its founding by the psychiatrist E. Fuller Torrey has been concerned with the decline in public provision of aid for those suffering from serious mental illness. Lisa joined the Treatment Advocacy Center in 2015, bringing many years of nonprofit policy and advocacy experience. Her prior work includes representation of refugees seeking asylum in the United States and many years of experience as a litigator in the areas of human rights and civil liberties. Dr. Sally Satell is a senior fellow here at AEI, a practicing psychiatrist, a lecturer at the Yale University School of Medicine. She examines mental health policy as well as political trends in medicine. Her publications include PCMD, How Political Correctness is Corrupting Medicine. That's from 2001, still very relevant. The Health Disparities Myth, 2006. And Brainwashed, The Seductive Appeal of Mindless Neuroscience. Finally, Stephen Eide is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor of City Journal. He researches social policy questions, including homelessness and mental illness, and he's at work on a new book on the subject to be entitled American Homeless, History and Tragedy in Social Policy Making. It's due out next spring on Rowman and Littlefield. So let me begin with you, Stephen, for the simple reason that you're just back from California, and There's some new data out on California. Street homelessness, according to a HUD report, California saw a 6.8% increase in homelessness just between 2019 and 2020, 16.2 between 2007 and 2020. That's the largest increase in any state in that time frame. You were just out in Los Angeles. Do those figures comport with what you saw there?
Yeah, as a homelessness researcher, I've been, reading the literature, looking at the statistics for a couple of years. I hadn't been out to California since the beginning of the pandemic. And the value for me in looking at conditions firsthand is it gave me just a really keen sense of how far standards of normalcy have fallen in California. Driving around LA, walking around, all the time I encountered scenes that in any other city people would react to, politicians, the media would react to with obsessive concern, whereas in Angelenos react with, they almost take them in stride. Tense up in public parks, tense up all around City Hall. In New York City, which is the homelessness situation I'm most familiar with, homelessness is certainly considered a crisis, but outside Manhattan in the transit system, there are large swaths of New York City where you don't encounter much homelessness at all, to say nothing of the greater New York City area, beaches in Long Island, suburbs in New Jersey. In LA, it's just everywhere, in Venice and Santa Monica and Malibu. I stopped by the Malibu Public Library last week, and almost every patron there appeared to be homeless. In California, homelessness is considered a gubernatorial responsibility. And very few American states is that considered to be the case. It's really not considered the case in New York, where certainly New York City's crisis is the mayor's responsibility, not as much the governor's responsibility. But that's just a measure of how pervasive the problem is all throughout California. It really has grown to be, I would say, one of the defining social problems, social policy challenges of our time.
Well, thanks for that report from the front. Let me take that question of who are the street homeless to Lisa Dailey of the Treatment Advocacy Center. Can you help break down that population? Was I misplacing too much emphasis on the mental illness and substance abuse issue, or is that something that's occupying a lot of your thinking?
No, I would definitely say that, all of the data really supports your assessment that, obviously the entire population of people who are experiencing homelessness is not made up of people who have severe mental illness, but it is a really, really disproportionately large percentage when you consider that, the number of people in the country who are affected by severe mental illness or serious mental illness is somewhere around about 3 to 4%, but the population of homeless people is really affected by somewhere closer to about 30% to 40%. So it really, what you can see there is that a person who has severe mental illness is extremely vulnerable to becoming homeless in a way that the general population simply isn't, and that's really the case throughout the country. I mean, we certainly have cities that have a larger population of homeless people in different cities, but it really is kind of a nationwide issue, and it's on the rise. It's increasing really everywhere. And what Stephen is saying about you're really seeing this everywhere in California is exactly consistent with what I saw when I was most recently in California as well. I mean, I was in a city where you would not typically think of Monterey as being a place where you would see, an enormous homeless population. But it was there. I mean, there were tent cities. The public squares were taken up, and that really is increasingly the case all across the country. I mean, it's recently as a couple of years ago when there was an update to the data. I know Roanoke, Virginia, has had a 300% increase in homelessness over about a decade, which is really a really astonishing number when you really think about like the fact that this is an increasing number and it's increasing really throughout the country. And really what you're looking at is you're looking at populations that are extremely vulnerable to falling victim to a lot of different conditions that can play into a person's likelihood to become homeless in the future.
And so just to be really clear, when we say severe mental illness, a lot of people have suffered during the pandemic, depression, anxiety. what constitutes severe, serious mental illness?
There's a couple of different definitions that different entities will use, but for Treatment Advocacy Center, what we mean when we're talking about severe mental illness and serious mental illness, which the terms are somewhat interchangeable depending on what you're specifically discussing about in the research. But really what we're talking about, it would be largely schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, like severe depression that has psychotic features, and really like any kind of illness that has the ability to lead to a psychosis or a loss of touch with reality is really what we're specifically talking about. And obviously there's a great deal of overlap between people who are vulnerable to severe mental illness and also may have a comorbid diagnosis of substance use disorder. So there's quite a bit of overlap between those two populations, but that's who we mean when we're talking about those with serious or severe mental illness is really those diagnoses primarily.
So let me turn to Dr. Sally Satel. Just yesterday in New York, there was a situation where a woman was pushed onto the subway track, didn't quite fall in, but there have been numerous instances in which people have been pushed onto the tracks, and the person apprehended was said by their family to have suffered from schizophrenia for many years. And they said, we wish she could be in an institution. We wish she would take her medication. She's okay when she's taking her medication, but this is tragic and we feel horrible about it. From the point of view of psychiatry and treatment, how did we get to this point?
Well, as you know, there's a legacy of deinstitutionalization. It really started, I guess, in late 50s, and mental psychiatric hospitals now, state-based, in fact, they're almost all state facilities, have largely been decimated. Now, to be fair, in the 40s and 30s, and that one of the reasons that they were evacuated is because they were often horrible places, and they needed to be reformed. There was no question. Also, in the late 50s, Thorazine, which is a powerful, often very effective antipsychotic, came along, so making it possible for people who were at treatment. Well, there really weren't that many treatments, but who were not responding to treatments at the time, made them stable enough where they could live in the community. And that really is the goal always, to have people live in the community. But a combination of the fact that these institutions were really poorly run and literally, as the name has been, snake pits often, plus the fact that a medication had come along that was at the time hoped to be a real revolution, a pharmaceutical revolution that would help this population. And it did help a lot, but it's certainly not enough. Led to this movement, which, as I said, has essentially depopulated the institutionalized population, the institutions. And the 1963 legislation frankly, President Kennedy signed, and I think it was October 31st, 1963, which is the Community Mental Health Centers Act, was well intended to receive these individuals in the community, but unfortunately, not enough were built. And also there was a philosophy among many psychiatrists and also at NIH at the time, which is that much of the origins of the psychosis was societal in origin. And was a product of poverty, of inner city stress. Those conditions certainly don't help one's mental health, but they certainly don't create psychosis. They exacerbate it, yes, but they don't create it. And so these floods, because this was happening, these waves of people coming out of the institutions really were not, frankly, had really nowhere to go. And that was probably the beginning. Of course, it wasn't until the 80s that I think we talk about what is the precursor of our current homeless crisis, but that's kind of the roots of the problem.
And I know when I see people on the streets, I think, could they be helped? And so as a practical matter, from a psychiatric point of view, could people on the streets who are talking in loud voices to themselves, and I met such a person yesterday in Manhattan, they're there. I'm sure they're in LA. In the proper environment, could such a person be helped by modern psychiatry?
There's a lot of medications that can be extremely helpful for psychosis. Granted, the longer someone has been psychotic, they may be somewhat resistant to these medications, but they can always help. So yes, we have medications. I could read you out a list of them where pharmaceutical companies now, I mean, we've gone way past Thorazine in terms of what there is to offer. The newer medications have somewhat fewer side effects. They all do carry some side effects, to be sure. And many of these medications have what's called a long-acting form, long-acting injectables, LAIs, where a person doesn't have to take them every day. You can get an injection, can last up for weeks, sometimes months. You can imagine the how efficient that kind of thing can be. We have the same thing for drugs for addiction. I mean, methadone is a medication one takes daily, but buprenorphine can be given as an injection that lasts a month, or even in implants, which lasts 6 months. There's naltrexone, which can last up to a month. That's a blocker of opioids and also has some effect on alcohol. So all these things exist. That's the real bottom line. But the real hurdle is getting people to take them. I mean, the very fact that, granted, our mental health system, and Lisa could talk for hours on this, is terribly fragmented, people falling between the cracks all the time. So there is that problem. But there's also the problem of many of these folks not wanting to take the medications. Either they've had bad side effects in the past, bad interactions with psychiatry in the past. A lot of people don't want to have their edge taken off when they're on the street. They want to be alert. And these medications, they should not sedate you, but they are often somewhat sedating. And I mean, they shouldn't sedate you to the point where you aren't alert. So there's that kind of resistance often to taking the medications. Plus, some large fraction of people with schizophrenia literally do not acknowledge, I don't mean they're in any kind of psychological denial. I mean, they're almost at a neurological level of we call neglect if it were a stroke. In other words, you don't know that your, let's say, left arm is paralyzed. You don't know that. It doesn't register neurologically on that cognitive level. And that also applies to some people with schizophrenia. They do not, in fact, Fuller Torrey's sister, which he talks about written about extensively.
He was the founder of the Treatment Advocacy Center.
Yeah, he's a hero in this field. And his sister was psychotic, and she never acknowledged that she had a mental illness. She always said, well, she, had a cold when she was in her teens, and then this is the effect of it. And why should she take medication? So these are all the big hurdles. And if I could just say one more thing, the dual diagnosis problem that you brought up is absolutely huge. And so when you have someone whose underlying problem is psychosis, the effect of the drug, depending on the drug, typically a stimulant, but often marijuana and so many of the synthetics out there can exacerbate the underlying symptoms of hallucinations, delusions, agitation, as can withdrawal from the opioids. So you've got a double layer of difficulty. So it's very hard. So the short answer is yes, there's a great panoply of pharmaceuticals out there that can be helpful, and all kinds of social supports once someone's stabilized. But unless someone is motivated to take them, or we can get them to stand still, it's almost as if the medications don't exist.
Steve and I just want to underscore hallucinations and delusions. That's like a very important factor to keep it in mind, why people do things that seem so antisocial. But Stephen, in your work on homelessness, you've written a lot about the emphasis on housing that is almost implied by the term homelessness. if one is homeless, one needs a home. And that spawned something called the Housing First movement in response to the situation of these street sleepers. Talk about the Housing First movement. Is it an important prerequisite to treatment? Has it steered us in the wrong direction?
The modern homelessness crisis is generally considered to have started around in the early 80s. That's when the term homelessness became known and entered popular currency. Before that, we used other terms: vagrant, derelict, bum, hobo, tramp. And the advocacy community created this term. They're very open about this. First of all, because they said it was less stigmatizing, but also it pointed directly towards more investment in housing and subsidized housing on the part of the government. We can invest in housing in a number of ways to help this complicated, diverse population that we group into the category homeless. But by the late 90s and early 2000s, this theory of housing first had come to define what it meant to invest in housing for the benefit of the homeless population. We'd always had affordable housing programs. What does affordable housing geared towards the homeless look like? Housing first philosophy, which is a philosophy, ultimately stipulates that though it is the case that the homeless population has many behavioral health problems with chronic unemployment, you can't fix any of that until the housing piece is in place first. So you get somebody off the streets and in housing, and then you work on everything else. The model that led from Housing First is known as permanent supportive housing. It's a permanently subsidized apartment, somehow connected with supportive services, though those services are provided on a purely voluntary basis. Someone is not put in a Housing First permanent supportive housing program under the expectation that they need to submit to drug tests, they need to participate in services. You make it available to people, but if they participate or not, that's up to them. And the success of that intervention is judged based upon whether or not they stay in that apartment, not whether or not they improve their lives in terms of getting sober, achieving mental stability, or beginning some sort of supported employment program, something like that. Housing First is the dominant philosophy in homeless services. HUD is for years it has been the official philosophy of homelessness at HUD. In major crisis jurisdictions such as New York City and California, it is a state requirement for state-funded programs that they adopt Housing First. And this has, and as a result of this, so the last 10 years has seen tighter and tighter Housing First requirements in the homeless services world, and also a big expansion in homeless services funding. But older programs that were set up under, let's say, a workfare mindset, or a mindset that residential stability is not the only requirement of success in homelessness. We're also interested in things like sobriety or mental stability, and we want to be judged based upon that. Those were left out of the recent expansion in funding, and in some cases had their funding cut. So now what you have in New York, California, very large homeless services system, big increases in funding, more funding to come. But really what we're doing is it's all about Housing First permanent supportive housing. And the backlash that's developing in places like California is, okay, so what happens in the meantime before this utopia where everybody has their own subsidized apartment for the rest of their lives arrives? Okay, because these programs seem to take a long time. Units are coming online at a trickle, and yet the situation in the streets remains chaotic. What happens in the meantime? I'm not against permanent supportive housing. I understand some people need subsidized housing, but these programs, just despite these huge increases of funding, have not registered any appreciable differences in the streets or in the official statistics. So don't we need to be talking about some sort of modification to the status quo? That's, I would say, the state of play in the debate right now.
Right. And so your concern about Housing First is that it could devolve into housing only. Let me turn back to Lisa and talk about kind of the legal environment. Both Dr. Satell and Steve Eide have reminded us that you can be offered help, but you don't have to take the help. There was a time when involuntary institutionalization was part of the legal landscape. do we need to go back to something like that, or is that really unthinkable in the civil liberties oriented universe that we live in now?
Well, I guess first of all, I would say that involuntary treatment and involuntary institutionalization they're not the same thing. I mean, like back in the 50s, when people might be institutionalized for long periods of time, that was when there really was no effective treatment available that was medically oriented. So this is before Thorazine. This is before some of the other medications that really have changed people's ability to recover and go back to their lives. So, that institutionalization was a thing that occurred when there wasn't really a medical alternative that allowed people to return to the communities with proper care and supportive services. And but there's always going to be a need for there to be an acute care phase for people who have mental illness that can be severe, that can require hospitalization. And that's something that I think needs to be acknowledged within our public policies. And, obviously, a person who is experiencing a first episode of psychosis may require hospitalization in order to determine, what is their diagnosis? What is the medication that will work? Stabilize that person, allow them to return to the community. That doesn't mean that you will ever be able to entirely get rid of the need for there to be an acute care level. So there does need to be hospitalization as something that can be part of a person's treatment progress through the system. And it does exist now, but it exists in such inadequate numbers that what really happens is that a person who may be hospitalized and the standards for meeting those requirements to be hospitalized are a lot higher than they used to be.
Talk about that for a minute. Talk about the shortfall in beds and the increase in standards that you're referring to.
Well, there's two things. Like there is an increase in standards in some states, and obviously every state is different, and every state has its own laws, and they kind of approach this differently. But in general, in any state, if somebody poses a danger to themselves or to someone else, they can be subject to inpatient hospitalization to be stabilized and treated so that they can, hopefully improve and then return to the community. And what that means in every state is a little different. So sometimes danger to self or danger to others means only being somebody who is likely to be violent towards themselves or violent to someone else. Or sometimes it means somebody who's not able to care for their needs or to meet their basic needs, which is really the most appropriate standard to look at when you're looking at hospitalizing somebody who is maybe a chronically homeless individual and it is due to mental illness. That's kind of the standard that you would be looking at in order to seek an intervention that would put that person in the hospital in order to stabilize them. And like many of the states have either seen that their standards over the years, had evolved to have higher requirements, that you had to meet a higher standard in order to be subject to be hospitalized in the event of a mental health crisis or not being able to meet your basic needs. But then there's also just the pressures of the system also lead to people just maybe not being hospitalized due to a lack of capacity or lack of resources, where you tend to interpret the criteria according to what resources you have within the system. So, because you don't have very many beds that are available, that changes whether or not you think the person that's standing in front of you actually meets those criteria, even if the criteria haven't changed. And that's something that is kind of an unspoken pressure within our system that I think a lot of people don't acknowledge, is that if you do not have resources available, you will not be able to, like you can't hospitalize somebody when you know that they will have to stay in your emergency room and there's nowhere to put them. It will influence whether or not you think the person meets criteria. And that's a big part of our system. All of the pressures within our hospital system are to get people out and get them discharged as fast as possible. And that generally does mean that they are being discharged before they are stabilized.
Right. So the phrase acute care stage has entered our vocabulary here. So it's worth keeping that in mind. Dr. Satell, does what Lisa Dailey say there about the experience of kind of an implicit triage going on comport with your experience in psychiatry or what you know about what's going on in psychiatry?
Oh, well, of course. She's living and breathing this every day. We have some emergency rooms where people will stay for a week in the emergency room because there's no bed. And yes, the problem of sending people out before they're stable is a big one. And then whether they keep Whether they can get a follow-up appointment in a timely manner, that's an issue. Whether they keep that appointment, and if they're homeless, the chances are, understandably, they're not. They're going to lose a piece of paper it was on, and it's a mess.
Right. So if you had the chance to put them, we've obviously had a huge reduction in beds, as they say, correct?
Yes.
Right. And I'll just remind the audience, we're interested in your questions. You can post them in the chat, or you can send them to #AEI on cities, or to the email address below, kawit.pomred@aei.org. We're interested in your questions, and we'd like to refer them to our panel. Stephen, we're implicitly having a discussion about how we can change the legal regime so as to make more practical, effective treatment. Have you given thought to that?
Yeah, I want to stress one thing that's came out of Lisa's remarks, which is that there's the legal question, but then there's essentially also the fiscal question of how you pay for inpatient care, and that governments, if talking about sort of government-controlled systems, if they can find other ways to pay for inpatient care, then they may rethink or respond in different ways, even if the legal criteria remain the same. The big issue that I've looked at, and that Treatment Advocacy Center spent a lot of time looking at, is Medicaid financing for inpatient care, or the lack thereof. Many people don't understand that the deinstitutionalization process, which, as Sally laid out, developed over a number of decades. One major factor in that was Medicaid.
Medicaid, of course, should, in theory, be paying for the care of these indigent persons.
Yes, people with disabilities, very, very poor people. And Medicaid is an enormous funder of mental health, the largest funder, I believe, of mental health care services in America. But since Medicaid began, well, when Medicaid was passed, there were still this traditional state hospital system, a few 100,000 people being in a long-term basis. And the federal government had the attitude that we're not about to be put on the hook for people staying in a mental hospital for decades on end. If states want to continue to keep doing that, states have to pay for that on their own. We're more interested in funding community services. So states, predictably, followed the money and started to, and deinstitutionalization really accelerated in the late 60s, early 70s. And by that point, you're talking about a more troubled population, more with greater needs that was being put in community settings, really before those community settings were ready to treat them effectively. And that has more or less remained this IMD exclusion, this provision in Medicaid, the Institutions for Mental Disease exclusion.
IMD is Institutions for Mental Disease,
which generally prohibits Medicaid for paying for inpatient care in a facility for adults between the age of 18 to 65 in a facility with over 16 beds, which has been in place in more or less some form since the passage of Medicaid, has substantially contributed to this loss of beds. And when the beds, and which continues, I mean, in the current state budget in New York, the budget that is for the current fiscal year, they cut beds. Okay, so this is not something that happened back in the 70s and we're dealing with the consequences. We're still losing beds now. Okay, and that is substantially in it. But if the state government of New York was able to fund that type of care in part with the federal assistance, it might react differently, even if the legal standards are the same. So there's certain things we could think about doing, but we need to think differently about these questions of the use of hospitals and the core bed challenge.
Yeah, and just to interject, I'm being a little ironic, but there is one place where the IMD exclusion doesn't apply, and that's jails and prisons. And that's where so many folks will end up, and from there be discharged with even probably in general, I think even less provisions put in place than people leaving emergency rooms. Plus, depending on how long they're in jail, and I don't know what the threshold is, but their Medicaid, if they had it, could be cut off. And then it takes, you can imagine the labyrinthine effort to reestablish that.
Right. So is there a pipeline, as they say, that leads from incarceration to street homelessness?
Oh, yes, definitely.
It's a two-way street, actually. Those
Right.
two factors are extremely related and in both directions.
Well, talk about that.
Well, obviously, a person who's homeless is at high risk for being incarcerated because, especially as cities have declared emergencies with homelessness, a lot of them have criminalized sleeping on the street. So, I mean, like you're much more likely to be arrested if you're a person who's experiencing homelessness because of the fact that just the simple fact of being homeless has been criminalized in a lot of cities. And there's also a lot of, to the extent that a person might be likely to be experiencing substance use disorders, if you're not living in a place where that has been decriminalized, those are all places that, where you can be arrested. You can be arrested for disorderly conduct, for public urination, things that are sometimes referred to as nuisance crimes and that are definitely associated with homelessness. It's just like, obviously a person who is arrested for that kind of a violation is likely to go to jail. The person that's been in jail is therefore, they now have a record that makes it more difficult for them to be eligible for emergency housing or for placement in public housing. I mean, obviously, Section 8 housing has requirements for you can only have certain kinds of criminal background in order to be able to qualify for that housing. So it feeds off of one another. The more that you're homeless, the more like you're likely to have your conduct be criminalized and end up in the criminal justice system, and therefore the harder it is to find housing once you're out.
And so the outlet becomes street homelessness.
Right.
Homeless
Or
people
just going back and forth between the two.
Yeah, Steve?
Homeless social science researchers have looked carefully at the rate of victimization of homeless people. It's far higher than that of non-homeless people. The rate of homeless on homeless crime is a large driver of victimization of homeless people. And homeless people say often, when they're asked, why don't you go into shelter? It's because I don't feel safe. Well, basically everyone in shelters are other homeless people. Robbery, assault. And another thing that the people in LA really stress a lot is gangs. I mean, if you're talking about a constituency with this extraordinarily high rate of substance abuse, I mean, that's a captive market for people who are in the drug business, who are made themselves be not homeless. And so when you're in Skid Row walking around, sometimes you see pretty nice cars, people who look like they're very healthy, well-fed. And why are they there? And they're there to prey on homeless people.
Sally, this is slightly maybe off the top, maybe not. I saw that John Hinckley was released without any oversight. He shot the president of the United States some years ago, and he was confined in a private mental institution for many years. I don't know his diagnosis really, but since he's had some delusion that he was impressing a famous actress by shooting the president of the United States, I assume that he was a schizophrenic. Does that story tell us that schizophrenia is a treatable disease and we're leaving schizophrenics untreated?
Well, yes, as I said earlier, people who, especially when they're young. In fact, there's a whole new, very exciting, I don't know how new it is, but it's relatively new field of research and treatment addressing what's called the prodromal phase. In other words, we're talking 16, well, that's young, but late teens is when many young people who are going to manifest schizophrenia will start to show early symptoms. If you get in there with medications, it could change the face of this illness, really. It's a very exciting thing. But so, yes, again, people can be definitely responsive. As far as Hinckley goes, I guess he was schizophrenic. If I recall, his diagnosis wasn't that clear cut, but he was psychotic, and I'm not. If anyone is worried, I'm not. He's this is how many decades he's had passes. Wasn't a decision made overnight. He's had long stays at home, so where he's been monitored, and he's probably I don't know if people remember Andrea Yates, in a way, a much more straightforward case to the extent that she was had postpartum psychosis. She was a Dallas mom in 2000 or Houston, excuse me, 2001. She drowned her children, and I believe she may still be in a long-term psychiatric facility. I mean, there are people who, when they respond, could be out in the community, frankly, quickly, certainly with supervision, certainly with oversight, but in her case, there's obviously, it was so dramatic and so horrific that they extend the hospitalization. But it's been well documented that people who are not guilty by reason of insanity will spend more time in a psychiatric hospital than someone who had committed the same crime, but not under the umbrella or not motivated by a mental illness. They'll be in different facilities. One would be in criminal justice. One would be more in a civil or a setting of a forensic hospital. But I guess that's a little bit of a detour. The point is, people respond.
I'm just bringing it up because it's in a weird way hopeful that somebody who did something so horrific could be returned to society, and we accept that.
If I could jump in, Dr. Torrey and I actually co-authored a report that came out in 2017 where we were discussing precisely this issue, where we're talking about, what is necessary to make it safe for a person with a violent history and severe mental illness to return to the community. And, there's actually quite a bit of research that documents that if you provide appropriate and adequate supports, but that does involve, robust enough community support and supervision of the individual, people can recover sufficiently to return and thrive in the communities. But you need to invest in making that a safe alternative for that person and for the community, which is where a lot of communities fall short, is that they, once the person has been released, they lose track of them, or they don't provide the services or the support or the oversight to ensure that they are continuing to be safe for themselves and for others in the community. And when a lot of times when you see somebody who's got a history where they've been returned to the community, if you look, what has happened is that support has not been there, and that's why it didn't succeed.
All right. And that was actually part of my point, really, which is that if his condition wasn't so politicized and others weren't, he probably could have gotten even out earlier, much earlier, if those supports that Lisa mentioned were in place.
Yeah, I think actually lives with his mother. But speaking of communities falling short, this is a question that's coming from the audience for Stephen Eide. Are there some places, cities, or states that are getting this right? And why is California's situation so acutely not right?
When I'm asked this question as a sort of what works question, which city should we get behind? My general answer is, which city is getting it right? My general answer is, I don't know of a city that has allowed homelessness to swell to crisis proportions and then got it back under control. There are cities where it never got under control. It never reached San Francisco.
Never got out of control.
Which is the case of most cities. But sometimes you read about these success stories. Salt Lake City and Utah were hot for a while and received a lot of press coverage. But as the years pass and scrutiny increases, those successes revealed to be not as impressive as initially advertised. And I tend to be very cautious when I hear about new success stories. My general thought is that don't let it get out of control, because if it swells to LA proportions, you're probably going to be living with it for a very, very long time.
Well, that's a dark response for the people in Los Angeles who would like to think they can damp this down or help people who are on the streets. Maybe that's the best way to put it. But that brings us to another question from the audience. How does the panel believe nonprofits and local government agencies should attempt to treat people who are resistant to the idea of living in shelters? And Stephen talked about that. What can we do if we can't say, come with me? And Lisa, does the Treatment Advocacy Center have a plan?
Well, I mean, honestly, the way that we look at it is that in order to treat the population who's most likely to be homeless, who have serious mental illness, you have to be willing to use the tools that are available for people who are the most sick. And you need to build a system that is able to treat the people who are at the farthest end of the spectrum in terms of, having a lack of insight, not realizing their illness, not being willing to volunteer for treatment. If you set up a system that can treat that population, you will also be able to treat the rest of the population. But too often, what we see in the way that that the states and local governments have set up their response, it's based on really catering to people who are not as sick. They're catering to people who will volunteer for care. And if you only set up that kind of a system, you will leave out people, and there will be people who will remain largely invisible to the system. And, even if you just look at it as, if you ignore the human suffering angle, and if you just look at the issue of what is the cost to the system, those are the highest utilizers of public services. So you do need to tailor your response to people who maybe require involuntary care, maybe require longer term care, maybe somebody who might need to be hospitalized long enough to be able to regain some ability to kind of recognize that they benefit from treatment, even if they never fully regain, their insight into their illness. So, I think what we recommend is that your system of care for people with mental illness, and that includes your care for people who are homeless and have mental illness, is that you need to target the system to be able to treat the people who are the most ill.
Right. This is a big deal, what you've just said. And you also, just to remind our audience, you said that that's not the incentive system under which governments are operating, that they tend to want to help those people who are easiest to help. So that's a big difference. But you talk about a system, Dr. Satell. What would that system look like from your point of view to help those who are not raising their hand and say, help me?
Lisa said one of the words the controversial word, involuntary. Sometimes they're just, it has to be an involuntary dimension. Now that everyone wants that to be the strategy of last resort. And, one way, it could be a strategy of last resort is to make the services that exist and the ones we still need more, I'd say more attractive, more
attractive.
Well, I don't mean with nice paintings on the wall. I mean more responsive. Sometimes they benefit from having other folks who've been through the system, and they can, it's more, frankly, more human, more attentive. Imagine if someone offered you temporary housing, which is certainly, we all think that's better than living on the street. I've met folks who frankly sometimes prefer living on the street to some of these shelter type facilities because stuff gets stolen from them all the time. The staff aren't always as accommodating as one would hope. If you're talking about a housing situation, if you have someone who really wants to stop using drugs, what's it like to have someone in the next apartment who is using drugs and who's provided clean foil by it is the harm reduction. This is what's, I very much support the philosophy of harm reduction, but at some point it does become, they always say, meet people where they are. And there's a lot of wisdom to that because you want folks to trust you and develop a rapport. And then, sometimes if there's just too much leniency and no discipline, that's very off-putting to a lot of people. They don't want to be in environments like that. They want to change their life. So
there might be, I'm just trying to put details onto this framework. So there might be shelters which sobriety is required, in which to enter this shelter, you have to be willing to take medication. Not one size fits all.
Yeah, it's a very difficult thing because, especially when it comes to addiction, a lot of people who have drug problems are ambivalent about giving it up, and sometimes when offered a choice, they will take. Yeah, I'd rather live in this situation and use drugs. It's tough. Now, the question is, and this is, I wish we had someone who ran a shelter here, because you can imagine things going in phases where there's more accommodation sort of early in the phase of someone coming in, and then we're tightening up. But I don't know if you can have patients or people on different tracks in the same system, because someone is in one phase of their trajectory where now they're not allowed to use drugs, but someone else is, and I don't know how that works, but I can imagine it being, you have to have these places run well by people who share the same philosophy.
Right, which was the problem with the old psychiatric hospitals, is there may have been a time when they first opened back in the 1920s when they were clean and safe, but they devolved and they were closed, not reformed. Steve, we have a question, a public health question, and I'm just struck by how much easier in a way it is to describe the problem than to sketch a solution. But here we are. But has COVID made this street homelessness situation worse, or has it presented additional public health problems? Has it put more people on the street, and has it made those who are on the street more of a public health threat?
We don't know. COVID clearly had a big impact on systems, homeless services systems. We don't fully know yet if it led to an increase in street homelessness, because, first of all, our street homeless numbers are always imperfect. The most recent information for January 2021 are not out yet. But in California, because following CDC guidance, all enforcement ground to a halt. There were no encampment cleanups. Encampments were accommodated in a way they weren't before. There was a general sense that it increased and certainly led to the spread, the dispersion of homelessness, especially in places like Venice, which didn't have as bad of a reputation a few years ago that it has now. When I was in Venice, there are RVs all around the community. They've been there since March 2020. They're dumping their sewage into storm drains that flow directly into the Pacific Ocean. So they're just beginning to get back to a little bit of sense of normalcy. I mean, normalcy by California standards. But that's, I think that's the popular sense. There was certainly there was a big issue of investing in hotel programs. Hotels nationwide were emptied out because of the tourism collapse. They were repurposed as shelters. And some of those are now probably, or have been, and more will be purchased and converted into permanent supportive housing. So the advocacy community really looked at COVID as an opportunity in addition to a unique challenge for the homeless population. But as far as but for now, at least in terms of the basic numbers, it seems to be kind of general continuity in the way that you laid it out in your initial remarks. General decline nationwide, but just as bad in crisis communities like California. I think let me say one last point about COVID. There's a fear that that the homeless population was just going to be leveled by COVID. In reading in the coverage in late February 2020, early March, I don't think and there were predictions put out in March by really reputable homeless researchers. I mean, top experts, that there would be thousands of deaths from COVID in the homeless population. We're not anywhere near those predictions. It wasn't anywhere near as bad as people initially feared. Although, this is a population with, low average life expectancy, many underlying conditions. So It was for the people who did catch COVID, who were affected by it. They were, uniquely affected by it in a way that you would expect of any vulnerable population.
I would agree that it's probably a little early to say what the result is going to be, but I will say that one thing that we definitely noted throughout the course of the pandemic so far is that there were a lot of hospital beds that were repurposed away from psychiatric use and towards use for COVID purposes. And we don't know yet what the impact has been on people who might otherwise have been accessing those beds from the homeless population with mental illness or substance use issues. We may find that, in the long run, that those people maybe were more likely to end up in jail or in prison as a result. But we do know that there was a shift of resources that, really took resources away from the psychiatric population towards general use during COVID. And we haven't yet seen what that impact will look like.
Right. So that's a variation on this general theme about COVID, is that other sorts of quote unquote routine screening has been missed, and we could have a long run series of health problems. In the time remaining, let's try to get as constructive as we can. And so Stephen mentioned hotel rooms being repurposed as supportive housing. He mentioned before that supportive housing may not have that much actual support, but let's assume there is something called supportive housing. The likely next mayor of New York, Eric Adams, has been talking about doing the same thing in New York, where the hotel industry has also been wiped out by the tourism decline. Are there opportunities now, and I'll go to each of you, that we can make incremental changes that would stop this problem from getting out of control in cities where it's not out of control, and help to reduce the numbers of street homelessness in cities where it's rampant? And I'll start with you, Lisa. Incremental changes.
I would say that one of the big incremental changes that could be made that would be helpful is improving the way that we collect data, so that we're following individuals across the spectrum rather than catching people at different points of the system. So we can see, if an individual enters the system, are they making it through the system and being able to stabilize? And then because at the moment we're looking at people within the system in the same way that the system operates, which is a really patchwork way of doing things. And until we start looking at individuals and following so that we can determine what the outcome is, we probably are not going to solve this issue.
Well, that's interesting. It's in the category of what performance measurement people talk about. You get what you measure. And so you're saying we shouldn't measure how many people are seen or how many people are housed, but rather how many people get well, or at least get better.
Yes.
Right. Dr. Satel.
Well, of course, the holy grail is the front end of this issue, which is, treating people before they become so symptomatic that they lose their housing, or they're thrown out of, evicted from wherever they are, or their family can't manage as much as they love them. They just can't manage anymore. So, that we discussed that before. About having systems that are better integrated, more responsive, well-staffed. So that, in a way, that's my answer. One very specific thing that we might try more of is a strategy called contingency management. And that's been especially well documented as being effective for people with substance abuse problems, which is where people are able to get small but actually meaningful rewards for complying with various aspects of treatment. And, with addiction, we focused, this may sound heretical to some, but we focus so much on the drug use, and I understand why, because we're dealing with a group that in many ways has shown they cannot use their drugs responsibly. But I think sometimes we get a little too caught up in whether they have marijuana in their, in a tox screen. And we really have to, I think, focus a lot more on is how they're behaving, how they're acting. Are they able to take care of, if they're a mom, are they able to, be with their kids? Are they able to, hold a job? Are they staying out of criminal situations at the very least? Are they otherwise, acting fairly responsible in the community? That's more important to me than whether they have, I work in a methadone clinic, and, if they have, marijuana in their tox screen, I want to know if they're keeping their job, if they're getting along with their spouse, these kinds of other markers of social fitness, because and I think there's a general receptivity to that view. These days, it was much more strict in the past, because you could, risk taking someone who's really making progress and ejecting them from a system because of, relatively trivial transgression like that, and then everything.
Okay. So it's very interesting. You're in a way, you dovetailed with what Lisa said earlier, that is, help those who are most in need and measure progress and appreciate that progress which is being made. But you also said something which is new to the conversation, which is stanch the flow of new potentially homeless people by providing treatment at a younger age. Okay, we got time for Stephen.
Or earlier in their phase.
Yes, earlier in their phase.
And that in particular.
Yeah, that may or not be a younger age, right? Earlier in their phase. Okay, and Stephen, how do we get things not out of control in the first place?
Very briefly. I know we're running out of time. I do have to speak up for just basic enforcement. I think that came up in every conversation I had in California. There are a range of laws and regulations that are just not being enforced. Environmental regulations, ADA regulations, fire code, sleeping at, no camping in park regulations. And by these not being enforced based on COVID or whatever reason, that is contributing to just so much cynicism and belief in government incompetence in California. So in some jurisdictions, you really need to be serious about tackling the enforcement aspect of the problem, because that defines so much for the man on the street what homelessness is. In the case of housing programs, I think we need to back off a little bit from the housing first philosophy. There will always be a need for low barrier programs, for programs that are lenient as far as sobriety goes, but we've gone way too far in terms of pushing out sober programs that focus on sobriety, transitional housing programs, just creating communities in which people can live in and support each other in their stability, in their sobriety. I don't think we've been investing enough in those programs over the last 10, 15 years. But also, it can't just be housing solutions alone. I believe that within the homelessness debate, the focus on housing really has crowded out a lot the type of mental health reforms that we've been talking about in this discussion. I've read so many comprehensive strategic plans on homelessness over the past years. If you like reading 150-page comprehensive strategic plans on public policy, homelessness is the issue for you. And very few of them talk about assisted outpatient treatment or the beds crisis, even though for many of us, those are salient issues. And so, I think a rebalancing of all the parts of this program is going to be required, and that will require pushing back on the housing-oriented solutions, as sympathetic as we may be to the fact that many people are going to need subsidized housing for the rest of their lives.
So another term was just introduced: assisted outpatient treatment, acute phase. There have been a lot of important phrases dropped in this discussion. I think it's been very constructive. I want to thank Lisa Dailey of the Treatment Advocacy Center, Dr. Satell of the American Enterprise Institute, and Steve Eide of the Manhattan Institute. A lively, constructive discussion that I hope will help to seed the improvement we desperately need in treating the street homeless population. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks.